Okay, sorry about that, everyone. That was actually not YouTube shutting me down. I accidentally kicked the. Okay, that was actually not YouTube shutting me down. I accidentally kicked the power cord that was connected to my router, so my router went off for a minute or two there. So that was just my retardation. That was not anything to do with stuff that people happened. Okay, so so let's just take a step back. There's two types of people who tend to be pro-Russia. There's the third worldists and there's kind of right-wing people. Now the right-wing people are pro-Russia because Russia is a very deeply flawed but still more conservative country than pretty much any Western country. They don't like America and American hegemony. It's not for the same reason that the other group dislikes it, but uh, yeah. Just if people are coming in now, I just accidentally kicked the cord that was plugged into my router, so it just turned that off. So it's not that YouTube shut me down or anything like that. Well, that's funny. It's showing I was watching some clips from The
Maybe,
Office.
maybe.
Uh, okay, what was I doing again? Yeah. Also, there's just a lot of people who hate the global American empire, and who see Russia as a counterbalance, and they're willing to more or less back anybody who's willing to hurt American political power and try to kind of take Americans to take them down a notch. Now, I think what's important to keep in mind when we talk about this is I don't think the American empire, the global American empire, is exactly the same now as it was during the Cold War. I think there's a lot of people who have um, kind of become like really anti-modern America, or have this weird revisionist thing where like communism was based, guys, and communism was awesome. And like if you're anti-communist, it means you're like a shill or something like that. So that's the one side of people, is the people who don't like what America is now, whether they've stated that it's become worse over time, or it was always bad coming back to right at the beginning, um, to the beginning of the country, and that it was always shit and that it was always terrible, and that kind of thing. So there are those people who support Russia for that reason. They also might see, uh, to a lot of people, they just want one. Um, I use the term indigenous European. They want one indigenous European, nominally Christian country to survive. And they see Russia as the best hope of that, along with places like Hungary or uh, Poland and some countries like that. And so that's the one side. And if we look at like post Cold War America, you see, particularly recently, and I've done a whole bunch of videos about this, um, America has basically just told everybody that you have to just debase yourself before us. Um, you have to do everything we tell you to do. There's no room for negotiation. There's no room for any kind of disagreement. You have to legalize gay marriage. You have to have post birth abortion. You have to have open border immigration. You have to do literally everything we tell you to do, or we will blockade you. We will use the National Endowment of Democracy to try to destroy you, and that kind of thing. And that's why a lot of people hate America, at least post Cold War America. That's why I dislike America. It's not necessarily that I dislike America itself. I think it's become an incredibly destructive force for evil um, throughout the world. And so I think a lot of people, you know what they say, they say the Dark Knight, and so they turn to a force that they didn't completely understand. And so people are like, well, Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa are anti America, so that automatically makes them good. The Soviet Union is automatically makes them good. It's also a lot of like, what would be the term? What's the term for something that retroactively trying to apply a modern idea to a previous age? I can't recall what the term is. It's not, neologism is like a term. I don't know. Someone could recall it, but they will like say, well, the Soviet Union was conservative compared to now, but like America was conservative compared to now at the same time period. If the Soviet Union existed today, you don't think they would support gay marriage and all this anachronistic? Thank you, Cyber Ninjas here. It's like, oh well, the Soviet Union didn't support gay marriage in the 1980s. Well, no one supported it. Like that just wasn't a thing in the 1980s. If the Soviet Union was still around, they might have wound up doing that. So there's also so there is that aspect of it. And those are one half of the people who support it. I use the term and kind of unironically, or rather the expression "we hate because we love." And you can, I hope you can feel this whenever I like diss Canada or I diss the United States or Great Britain. It's because they're my, like, it's my home, it's my country, and I hate what it's become. And I wouldn't hate it. I wouldn't like be so upset about it if I didn't love it. Like if it wasn't my homeland, if it wasn't where my ancestors were from, and seeing it reduced to the state that it is now is just deeply depressing. And some of it is honestly like a cope because um, the situation's so hopeless that kind of switching your perspective to say that all the people deserve it. They deserve the horrific things that are happening to them, a curse upon their houses, stuff like that. No, I haven't been watching Soprano clips. I've been watching what was it again? Michael Franchise clips. If you haven't seen him, he was a former capo in the Colombo crime family, and he does some good videos about it. I read the big. I read this massive book about the five families, um, and yeah. Okay, so that's one half of the people who are anti-America. The other half of the people who are anti-American are the third worldists. People who are descended from Maoism, from like Cold War era communism, who various, I guess, kind of local nationalist ideologies. Yeah, Michael Franchise is good. I like that he converted to. It's funny because he's like really conservative now, but he is like a masculine, heterosexual, white male. So he's, of course, who's an evangelical Christian, so of course he's going to be conservative. Um, what was I thinking of again? Uh, so I just lost my train of thought there for a moment. So, sorry again. Yeah, so their entire premise is based on anti-colonialism, and the idea is like that colonialism was the worst thing ever. We have to. It's a combination. Like, there's also a noble savage aspect to it. Like, there's this idea in a lot of third worldist, post-colonialist ideology that none of these countries had patriarchy. None of these countries had the death penalty. None of these countries were quote unquote homophobic. Um, yeah, he's from a better of men aside from his mob background. He becomes Catholic. Yeah, I've said this, and I don't. People haven't really given me too much shit for this. I'm fairly ecumenical, so I think if you're any kind of Christian, that's way better than being outside of the church. Like I kind of review. They can be cringe, but I do like evangelical Christians. They're mostly good people. But yeah, so like the perspective like that homophobia, quote unquote, that gay marriage existed in these societies, that none of these people had any issue with abortion. All of these people were like materialist, reductionist, atheists. That all of this superstition, that all of this stuff exclusively came from the West. So there's this noble savage narrative that's part of it. There's this view that Western countries are uniquely evil. I think a big part of this is they refuse to acknowledge that humans aren't interchangeable. So, like things like race, time preference, um, IQ, impulse control, uh, even just cultural things that were very beneficial to Europe, like prohibitions on incest, commitment to monogamy, stuff like that. They don't want to bring that up, so they just turn it into this weird like conspiracy theory. And so part of this perspective, um, okay, so to respond to what God said, um, no, I'm Catholic, and I think I okay, we can talk about that some other time. I'm not denying that the Catholic Church is the one true faith. I'm just saying I'm not the first. Anyways, I just other Christians are other Christians. So a Southern conservative once said to me, in the South we hate blacks as a race but love them as individuals. In the North they love blacks as a race but hate them as individuals. Um, so and that's kind of the perspective, and this gets into the whole like infantilization. But basically, the entire narrative is all human beings are interchangeable. I like the term interchangeable instead of equal because because equal can mean a lot of different things. From a Christian perspective, you can say that there's a certain basic equality among us, that we are all created in God's image, that people have an equal right to not just be arbitrarily murdered, that people have an equal right to not be aborted, stuff like that. And that says nothing about things like IQ, that says nothing about moral character, that says nothing about all kinds of other things. So you can have equality in like a legal sense, a moral sense. You can say, for instance, men and women are equal in a metaphysical sense, but they're different. So interchangeable, the idea is you can take any human from anywhere in the world, and their capacity is fundamentally the same. You can take an abo from any time period and put him in a European country, and he will be able to perform just as well as anybody within that context. Um, so that there is no fundamental difference. So therefore, any difference of outcome is a result of some sort of underlying conspiracy theory. So colonialism is the main one, Christianity is a big one, and that kind of thing. And so part of that is how that translates is I think the best example of third worldist ideology is Noam Chomsky. Now, if you've ever read a Noam Chomsky book, I would actually say he is one of the most extreme white supremacists I'd ever seen. Because his belief is basically that non-white people don't have agency. And if you read like any of his books, it's basically like his take on the Iranian revolution is that nobody in Iran supported the Shah. That the Shah was not overthrowing civilian government and reestablishing himself as an absolute monarch. That has no precedent in Persian history. That nobody wanted to. No, he had no public support for that. There was no conservatives in Iran. There was no nationalists in Iran who supported the Shah. That it was 100% the U.S. who was behind it. that we can take any like right wing or conservative government, and they are entirely imposed by the by America or some white country. That none of these countries have nationalist movements, have religious movements, have anything that would deviate from liberalism. So they have to blame white people in America for it. Um, and so you get into a scenario where basically no non-white person has agency. So, like, if you look at Rwanda, for instance, the Hutu Tutsi division existed long before the Belgians came. Did they exploit that and use that as a method of control? Yes, but the idea that, like, racial hatred or stuff like that just didn't exist before white people came is just insane. Like, the Aztecs were an incredibly brutal people. And this, like, attempt to take this narrative and say that, oh no, the Aztecs were like always this, like, yeah, this peaceful accepting people. The Aztecs had an extremely patriarchal society. The Aztecs were not big on the whole LGBTQ thing. I'm pretty sure they executed anyone who did that. They executed people who engaged in public drunkenness, who had affairs. They had, in a lot of ways, a very, I guess what we would say, puritanical worldview when it came to a lot of these things. So they have to deny that. They have to say that anything that happens in a third world country is America's fault. And so when this comes to the Middle East, they will say that Saudi Arabia's behavior, Hamas, ISIS, any of the Taliban, any of this is solely the result of white people, is solely the result of. No, the Aztecs were based. They were evil, but they were based. Like, it's. I did a video on this a long time ago. Like, do you think the Aztecs? How would the Aztecs handle the refugee crisis? How would the Aztecs handle a bunch of illegal African migrants coming into their kingdom and raping their women? I don't think the Aztecs would have put up with that. And like the video was me trying to, like, it was jokingly trying to me explain it to an Aztec. Like, could you even explain it to one of them? Could you explain it to any pre-modern people that, like, why we have to accept illegal immigrants who are carrying out like mass rapes? I don't think you could, regardless of the perspective. Um, Also, like, I read a book. I would actually recommend this book. It's pretty good. It's called Empire of the Summer Moon, I think. Let me find it. Yeah, Empire of the Summer Moon. Let me just bring this up. Which is a history of the Comanches. Um, so the Comanches were like one of the most savage people in human history, but at the same time, they were badasses. Like, the Comanches beat the Spanish settlers. Like, they beat the Spanish, they beat the Spanish army. They were so savage and so, like, insane that people, like, just fled from them, that were just, like, scared of them. And it's like, okay, so they're savage, but they're also badasses. Um, so it's like, okay, what's better, them being these like loser victims or them being these badasses? Um, and it's like, but it's a good book. It's kind of hilarious just how brutal they were. Um, uh, but yeah, sorry. So I'm gradually making my way through this. So the narrative that we get is that because none of these people have agency and anything that these people do is influenced by white people. The idea is that any sort of Islamic fundamentalism, Salafism, the Taliban ideology. I'm not sure if the Taliban ideology has a specific name to it because it's not Salafism, even though it's somewhat similar. Wahhabism, the Muslim Brotherhood, ISIS, all of these things are 100% transplants from the West. They were imposed on them by the West. There's no nuance, there's no complexity to this. It's just literally they implemented they put them in the they directly transplanted it. And once again, this thing is kind of complicated because, like, let's take ISIS for instance. I've said many times in the past the U.S. basically created ISIS. Now, does that mean that the U.S. had some 4D chess plan to give money to specifically set up this insane group that wanted to make an Islamic caliphate? I don't really think so. I just think they were retarded. I think a lot of the things the U.S. does is just because they're really fucking stupid. Um, and they just said, "Oh, Assad bad. Let's just give money to these random rebels." Um, we'll give money to these. We'll just give money to these rebels, and then the rebels turned out to be ISIS, and then they kind of spiraled from there. I do think Israel was a direct sponsor of them, and they wanted to use them as a weapon against Syria. Because wasn't ISIS like pro-Israel or neutral towards Israel? But likewise, I don't think necessarily like we talk about the Taliban. They were created by the U.S. in the sense that they gave them weapons and money, but did they want to create like the Islamic Emirate of Taliban of Afghanistan? I don't think so. So, um, so my point is that it's more complicated to that. You can have native like Islamist movements or whatever kind of movement that you have, but also have them like get a shot in the arm from the U.S. Like these movements might exist, and the U.S. just irresponsibly gives them a bunch of weapons and money and promotes them. Is that really though that the U.S. creating them, or um, is that the U.S. enabling them? And is that really the same thing? Is it really the same thing that they just to actively have created ISIS versus out of sheer retardation they just gave a bunch of weapons to people who turned out to be ISIS? I don't think it's really the same thing, to be perfectly honest. Um, and so when we get into Hamas, neocons will straight up acknowledge that the U.S. foments Islamic terror to fight proxy wars. I mean, to a certain extent, it's just I think it's more complicated than Hamas is a controlled opposition organization that was invented by the U.S. and is to this day like still controlled by them. That's my bread maker, by the way. That's not my fire alarm. Um, by the U.S. and there is no like native component to it. So yeah, I normally call them hummus. I call the Muslim Brotherhood the Super Muslim Bros. Um, so that's part of it. Um, I've even heard that Afghanistan was a play to eventually sick Islamists after China. I mean that like also people just say stuff and it might not be official policy. Like it could just be speculation. It could just be like somebody said that in some kind of idea that was thrown out there. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was its own policy. Yeah, I got a bread maker a couple of months back, and I've just been playing around with it, trying to get a good recipe. Because there are recipes, but it's just trying to get one that tapers to my individual taste. So yeah, I also make my own protein bars, um, which I need to make another batch of those soon. But what was I thinking about? Uh, so yeah, so that is the narrative of this conflict from the third world is that um, actually the one I've seen, and Brian Berletic and some people have brought this up, and this was like the most insane shit. This is like from something the early 2000s. The idea that Israel is an American puppet. Like it's just such a retarded idea. I can't even like imagine it. It's like what? How can you really think that? I mean, it's so obvious that it's this asymmetrical relationship. Like whenever Israel is in trouble, America just rushes like all the money, all the weaponry, all of its diplomatic power to try to save Israel. Um, to just try to go in and do anything to get Israel to like survive. So okay, I'll see you later, Supersod 64. Um, the other one I see a lot is like the idea that Taiwan is a U.S. proxy state. I mean, does U.S. support Taiwan? Yeah, but it's taking the perspective that like the 20th century didn't happen, that the Chinese Civil War didn't happen, that there was no member like because to try to like put into perspective, you would have to believe that the KMT didn't exist, that they didn't fight a civil war against the communists, that they didn't withdraw to Taiwan, that no one in Taiwan doesn't want to be subject to mainland China, that no one in Taiwan like is against being wants to be subject to the PRC and the CCP. Like it's just I think Taiwan legitimately doesn't want to be part of at least. So my understanding of the KMT's perspective, the left, the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan, wants full independence and wants to reject their Chinese identity. The KMT's perspective is a little more complex. Initially, the idea was that eventually they would retake the mainland and reestablish the Republic of China over all of it. Nowadays, their perspective seems more a pragmatic one that we want closer relations to China. We want more cultural and economic integration. We want more kind of cooperation, but we do not want to be politically subject to mainland China. So it's once again the idea that like it's just a complete psyop by the U.S. that there's no native Chinese opposition, there's no native Taiwanese opposition to becoming part like not like de facto as well as de jure part of the PRC is just nuts. Like it's not. You would have, like I said, you would have to deny all of. Um, Constantine says, I think the KMT and CCP could fully reconcile under certain conditions. Yeah, I mean, the KMT is a lot more sympathetic towards mainland China. I just don't think they want to be subject to the CCP rule. I think they want like some sort of loose confederation or some association agreement, but they want full autonomy in their own military and in domestic affairs, but maybe allow China to represent them, the PRC to represent them at the UN. Um, what is really interesting in Hong Kong is the right wing in Hong Kong is pro PRC and the left wing in Hong Kong is anti PRC. So, like the people who are socially conservative, Chinese nationalists, those kind of people tend to support the Communist Party, whereas the people who are liberal tend to oppose the Communist Party. Which, because the Communist Party is mainland China, and the people who want to assert a Chinese identity um, kind of have to support them by default. So, kind of an interesting side note is Chiang Kai shek has undergone something of a rehabilitation in mainland China. I don't think the government has formally like rehabilitated him. Well, they wanted the one nation, two states policy that Hong Kong had before the national security law. So Chiang Kai shek is, let me just look this up. It's kind of interesting. I know I'm going all over the place, but there's lots of interesting stuff. Rehabilitation. Okay, so this is Slate, but we'll take a look at this. So the official Chinese take on some aspects of the 20th century history has been one of the most consistent surprises for me on this trip. The photo above was taken. Okay, let's see here. Let's for this. Chiang and Mao were bitter rivals through most of their lifetimes. Uh, Taiwan. An exhibit presenting a sympathetic view of Chiang and his wife would once be unthinkable, but the general and particular role of his KMT forces played in fighting the Japanese during World War II has apparently undergone something of a historical reevaluation in the People's Republic. His legacy is being reevaluated on the mainland. His role in leading the nation against the Japanese invader during World War II is affirmed, and previously the thinking was that um, yeah. The other thing, later Gator, is the U.S. has done a lot to encourage anti-mainland, anti-Chinese identity. Like, I'm pretty sure Taiwan had a color revolution called the Sunflower Revolution. Let's see, a recent example, the founding of the Republic, a movie sponsored by the Chinese government to commemorate the 60th birthday of the PRC. Chiang is depicted as an honorable man um, who tried his best for China and betrayed the CCP because of human mistakes incited by bad advisors. So I think it is very interesting. It's one of the most interesting, I think, changes in modern Chinese politics is the rehabilitation of the PRC. Photos of Mao arch enemy Chiang Kai shek adorn the walls of a Beijing restaurant, and his face looks up at diners from the menu. Online, the disposed leader's image is used to sell the kinds of lamps and swords he might have used. A liquor brand has patterned its bottle on Chiang's memorial in Taipei. 20 years ago, now he's part of mainstream culture, sort of. There's been a grudging historic acceptance of Chiang's historical role in fighting against Japan following its invasion in the lead up of World War II. Points to present day politics. Chiang's rehabilitation has been really remarkable to observe from the outside and likely was undertaken initially as an attempt by China's leaders to tempt Taiwan into reunification by being a bit more. So let's see here. Now, of course, Chiang's role as someone who fiercely opposed the Japanese during World War II is politically very useful. Let's see here. Have gone from being portrayed as little more than corrupt and greedy characters to evincing patriotism and even courage as they fight the Japanese. Chiang's face is drawn on the bright yellow cover of a menu, selling posters of him. When we talk about Sun Yat Sun, it's no problem because I believe Sun Yat Sun is honored in um, has always been honored in the PRC because the three principles of the people I think is viewed as both the foundation of the PRC and the ROC. We haven't seen any official documents carrying positive comments, but it has been let's see here, rehabilitated quite a bit. The other thing I think to keep in mind is Maoism was like very third worldist and kind of internationalist. Once Dong took over, it became much more Chinese. It became much more nationalist, and so it was much less problematic to have a more positive view of Taiwan, of the nationalist government, and to view it as sort of contiguous with the. It's okay. So let me take this back. The gap from Dengist and Deng Xiaoping and no, from Dengist and Xi Jinping China to the nationalist government is much less than the gap between Mao and nationalist China. It's like the gap is like maybe like a 40% gap instead of a 90% gap. Uh, I agree with Later Gator. China rotted out our industry, flooded our country with opiates, and used TikTok for LGBT stuff. They can get fucked. Yeah, I agree. Um, I agree with Later Gator. Russia isn't our enemy, but China is. The pro-China stuff on the left and right is retarded. Yeah, I don't like communist China. I like I don't mind the Republic of China, and I don't mind the Qing or most of the Chinese dynasties. I don't like communist China for no other reason than they're communists. Later Gator is a schizophrenic. Yes, he kind of is, but he's our schizophrenic, kind of. So yeah, so basically the narrative that we have at the moment is that sorry, I'm jumping all over the place. That Hamas is controlled by the U.S. because they did some terrorist attacks, and anything bad that happens in the third world has to be done by the U.S. Um, was Hamas created for Baby? I will say this: the Opium War was one of the worst things that was ever done by the British Empire. I think the two worst things. Okay, so the worst things the British Empire ever did was import black slaves to North America. What they did to the Boers in South Africa when they ended the independence of the Boer republics and forcibly fused everybody into the Union of South Africa, and the Opium War. The Opium War is one of the most evil things in like human history. The Taipings actually executed opium addicts because one of the main reasons that the British intervened in the war against the Taipings was because um, they were very strongly anti-opium, and they killed a bunch of people who were they killed opium addicts and they killed opium dealers, and they banned the sale of opium in China. Uh, so part of my issue with modern China is that if we talk about modern China as being like a nationalist or a conservative state or whatever, modern China is like the modern Chinese government is not an advocate of traditional Chinese culture or traditional Chinese values. I think my friend Turellian put it very well. Um, the modern Chinese culture is a combination of the worst aspects of Han peasant culture with the worst aspects of materialist Marxist culture put together in this weird mixture with some like Chinese nationalism and Chinese symbols kind of sprinkled in, and it's just kind of a mess. And it's I don't know. So yeah, like I said, it's just kind of sad. So I do historically kind of like a lot of the Chinese empires. If nothing else, I just find them interesting because China represents a completely unrelated civilization that lasted a very long amount of time. Like if you look at the Middle East, There's a lot of different civilizations there, but they had direct contact with Europe and they influenced each other to a certain amount. China is completely alien and completely foreign, and they developed just very, very different worldviews that aren't related to ours. It's also why I find kind of New World cultures interesting because, once again, they're a completely different civilization that developed independently of ours. It actually, a lot of my views don't come from political philosophy per se. They come from looking at what successful societies did. Like marriage is something every successful society has had some degree of patriarchy. Keep in mind when I say I don't necessarily mean like women are property or something, but male led society, the death penalty, stuff like that. They independently somehow developed in like every society that went anywhere. And they talk about like some random ass tribe in Africa that's matriarchal that never invented the wheel or like barely invented fire. And they're like, see, these alternatives exist. I'm like, yeah, but they're shit. like, they're awful. They're like cannibal degenerates like who practice polyamory and stuff like that. An interesting I think one of the most interesting things that someone pointed out to me is how dysgenic polygamy is. For the simple factor that men can't produce enough sperm to impregnate that many women. So you'll have like a Chinese emperor and he'll have like 300 concubines and he'll only have like 50 kids or something. So he's like taking the most attractive, high status women he can find and not adequately reproducing with them. The other issue is that polygamy is too much fun. Like, like an unrestrained, if you want to see what an unrestrained male sex drive is, look at like homosexuals because they have an unrestrained sex drive and they can basically just have sex whenever they want. And men are savages when it comes to that kind of thing. So if you have like dozens of hot women, um, maybe you can't, bro. Well, I mean, this is just kind of fact. Also, there's so if men can spend all day fucking women, then they will do that instead of running the country. Under a monogamous society, the leaders can't do that all day, and they have to spend at least some of the time running the country. Um, it limits their degenerate. It limits the amount of time they can spend doing it. That was actually what stopped the Taipings. Was when they took Nanjing. They all um, when they took Nanking, they all went and got their own harems, and they just spent all day fucking them. And they completely lost interest in the war, and they just lost all momentum because of that. The siege of Nanjing was also interesting because the Taipings expelled most of the population, and they tore down a lot of the buildings and started farming inside of Nanjing. So they were actually in a better logistical position. Yeah, like one of the reasons why Islamic societies are such clusterfucks, other than the rampant incest, um, it's actually really monogamy. Okay, but it's like they at least have to do it on the down low when it comes to their sexual proclivities. Um, in an Islamic society, you have too many legitimate male heirs. Like, even if in European society, let's say you have like 8 kids with your wife, you might have 4 sons. In an Islamic country, you might have like 40 sons. And then you get into really confusing stuff like if the oldest son is from your second wife, does he inherit before the oldest be a slightly younger son of your first wife? How does the line of succession even work? And we got into like insane shit like that the Ottomans did. I think that the Mughals also had a similar way. It's just the royal family gets so big, you just have to basically cull a lot of them periodically. So, but yeah, like just my point is, if you look at the world, certain trends tend to exist that are condicative to social stability, towards human progress, towards I don't mean pro I mean I don't mean progress in a liberal sense. Um, but you find this happens in every society that goes anywhere, and the ones that don't embrace these things get destroyed by the societies that don't. And it's not a perfect correlation, but it turns out a lot of the things that Christianity advocates happens to line up with this sort of thing. Like the family structure a is shown to be the most stable. Um, Banning incest wound up helping Europeans immensely because it prevented like the kind of insane like the stuff you see in the Islamic world. The exceptions that we have is like the Habsburgs, who the Catholic Church, wrongly in my opinion, kept giving dispensations to like marry their uncles and stuff. Um, Stuff like that. Some form of hierarchy. Like there's just a lot of things in Christianity that I think are conducive to a good stuff. The consequences of unhinged sexuality is good proof against subjectivism. If your rational judgment is so debased, you could rationalize doing anything and terrible things could happen as a result. Well, I mean, yeah, and that's when we get into stuff like I think I forget if it was Vox Day or someone who said that religion is conducive to civilizational progress because it lowers time preference. If you think that you're going to endure forever in a spiritual realm and you have that perspective of the importance of future generations, it helps your society to plan more for the long term. Um, it broke up tribal clans. Yeah, inbreeding is really bad. It is one of the things that really helped out uh, Europe. But yeah, but my point is just a lot of these. The other problem with when you're dealing with what's it called again? Um, the other problem when you're dealing with what is it called? Polygamy is it means that there's a lot of, are we going to talk about Russia? I mean, we can talk about Russia. I didn't have a ton else to say about it. Basically, Russia at this point in time is launching a full scale offensive on every front. The spring offensive turned out to be a complete and total disaster. Um, so I'll be back. I'm just gonna run an ad. I'm just gonna go take my bread out of my bread machine. I'll be back. Okay, I'm back. Um, so let's see here. Yeah, that did not turn out good at all. That is pretty disgusting. I think the yeah, I'm not even gonna swallow that. Oh. For whatever reason, I don't think the baking powder worked. So I'll have to do that. I'll have to try again. So we'll try again. Yes, we can. Fortunately, flour is very inexpensive. So I yeah. Anyways, I think that that's probably good for now. Um Hopefully we covered some interesting topics. I've been doing a lot of streams in these videos because they're getting a lot of views. I'll go back to doing some more media stuff. Eventually, it's just there's been a lot of stuff going on in the world lately. So, God bless everybody. Um, go in peace with Christ, and I'll talk to you again real soon.